I started my PhD work in the United States. And typically, if you're doing an experimental-based PhD, it's typically on the order of 6.5 years. When I started my PhD work, it was funded by the department itself on some of the research. And then at the end of my first year, there was a 2-year teaching fellowship that came along. And so that prolonged my study by an extra year. But I was paid to develop physics labs intuitively in a bilingual environment where students who are not physics students could really try to learn physics. That's important because in America, being a liberal arts education, a lot of people take physics classes. And so we had an experimental-based discovering physics approach where they could try to understand the nature of waves, particles, and the structure of matter. And we also rolled this out into neighboring schools. It was very interesting working with educational theorists and bilingual specialists and psychologists for cognitive learning. So all of this brought together the research, and I took part in some of the research, got a couple of papers out of it, and it was very useful, but it did prolong the PhD. At that point, my PhD work was continuing, and I was working in magnetic materials lab. And we were interested in trying to build a transparent or at least translucent magnetic crystal that could be used in optical computers, for example, and exploiting magnetic birefringence. I was also looking at the 2D antiferromagnetic structure of high-temperature superconductors. Things were going well. But unfortunately for me, my funding ran out for the research at this point. And so at this point, I was like, well, maybe I'll start with a new PhD advisor and try to go forward. And at this point, there was a chemist in the chemistry department who was a nuclear chemist doing work at Brookhaven National Lab. I had done some work there as an undergraduate on a particle physics experiment, which was very nice. And I'd spent a couple of summers there working on the particle physics experiments. And I thought it was a nice opportunity to go back, and this would have been at the research reactor at Brookhaven Labs, where they would take the neutron flux and study the structure of DNA or magnetic phase transitions with the neutron beams coming from the research reactor. One of those neutron beams would create exotic nuclei, and they would study this for the nuclear physics beamline. It sounded very good, so I swapped over to that. Went down to Brookhaven Labs, set myself up, I was ready to go, came back to Massachusetts, and on the 1st of April, my new advisor was looking for me and said, oh, I've been looking for you. There was a mishap, your PhD experiment burnt down. I was like, oh no, please say April Fools. And it never came. The apparatus that was set up for thesis experiments that would have just rapidly given me some data was totally destroyed. So I needed to come up with a new experimental idea, and that was possible. Oak Ridge Labs was developing some new beams. Being new, they were delayed for a year, and then another year, and then more time. And so in the end, my PhD, by the time I got my thesis, analyzed everything, and got the papers out, and completed my viva and defended it, it was about 9 years. It was a long process, but I learned a great deal, and part of that learning included patience and perseverance.